All right, we're going to get started for today. This is week 5 and for security compliance class. And today we're going to talk about planning an IT infrastructure audit for compliance. So this is actually planning the audit. What kind of things do I need to do in the planning phase of the audit? That means what kind of questions I need to ask? What do I need to have before I do the audit? If you're an IT person, then this is going to help you to structure your IT environment so that you can be audited, so that you will know what kind of information they're going to require or want from you. All right. So the learning objective, what we should be able to do after this chapter, we finish this chapter when we complete it, is to describe the components and basic requirements for creating an audit plan to support business and system configurations. So we're going to devise a method for audits in the IT department. Key things we're going to have to do is identify key building blocks and critical requirements of an audit. So we're going to look at all the different little pieces that we need to put together to do an audit. How to identify critical security control points and assess information technology security. So looking at those controls, we need to be able to identify the critical controls, the ones that are, basically, if we lose those controls, or those controls are how do you want to say, like people going around the controls, if they're can't remember the word, but if people are able to defeat those controls, that's going to be a big deal in your security. So we want to be able to identify those critical controls so that we can focus on them while we're doing an audit. How to obtain information through documentation and resources. A couple of chapters ago, we talked about where you would go to get information about all the different domains. There's different places. For the user domain, you might not stop at the IT department to get that information and documentation. You may have to stop at human resources. So knowing where to go to get that documentation and information. Being able to organize your IT security policies. So what kind of organization should be in those policies? And then the best practices for testing and monitoring what is going on the network. Before we start the audit, we need to define the scope, the objectives, the goals, and how often we're going to repeat the audit. So scope, that's going to include the information about how long the audit's going to go on. So the audit may take 2 weeks. The audit may take 5 days. We need to have that in writing and agreed upon before we do the audit. The audit is not going to go on indefinitely. We don't have an audit that goes on for a year or 2 years. It needs to be a fixed, like a set time. And then we're also going to tell the IT department that we're auditing what areas are we going to look at. Typically, we don't audit the entire 7 domains all at once. So you may get into a situation where we audit the user domain for a week, and then we audit another domain for a week. So the entire audit may take a month, but we're focusing on different domains at different times. So that's part of our plan when we before we actually do the audit, we have to sit down and go through these things in our mind, have meetings with the people that are stakeholders, people that are going to be interested in this audit. The goals must be aligned with the audit objectives. So we have audit objectives, and our goals for the audit must be aligned with those. The objectives should satisfy internal and external requirements. So you're going to have a set of policies that are internal to the company. You're going to have a set of regulations that are external to the company. The objectives of this audit should be able to satisfy the audit requirements for GLB or HIPAA, whatever that regulation is. So there's no point in doing an audit if it doesn't look at the things that we need to be looking at for the different regulations or policies that we're checking. And then typically we have a fixed period of time how often this audit takes place. They typically call that the rate of occurrence. So is it every 1 year, every 2 years, every 3 years? We need to decide on frequency. If we have a high risk environment, we may do it more often. Lower risk environment, less often. Remember, whenever we do one of these audits, it's a trade-off. We're going to impact our productivity because we're going to be pulling resources away from other activities. So it does cost to do one of these audits, even if it's an assessment, an internal audit. Remember, the most important thing while we're coming up with this plan is that the scope must be sufficient enough to achieve the stated objectives and not restrain the auditor unnecessarily. Okay? Sometimes the scope changes. We're going to talk about that, why the scope would change later on. But when we're planning, we don't want to restrain the auditor. So we want to get a good audit. We don't want to tell him that he can't go in certain places or do certain things if it's going to impact the quality of the audit. And some restrictions that might affect the quality of the audit is not providing enough resources. Right? So when we're planning the audit, we need to have people that can answer questions. We need to have the manpower to go check all the systems. If we don't, then that's part of the scope planning. We need to make sure that we have enough resources that we can do the audit. We don't want to make the time frame too short because we might not be able to do everything that we need to do for the audit. Restricted audit procedures. We don't want to do that too drastically. And other things that might impact the audit might be maybe you don't have relevant historical records or information about past incidents. So we want to make sure that we have access to all the paperwork we need. We have enough time. We have enough resources as manpower, things of that nature. We don't want to restrict the auditor too much. We do want to have a scope, but we don't want to make the scope too small. Here are the resources we're talking about when we plan. So we don't want to, when we're scope planning and we're putting the resources in that the person needs, we want to make sure that they have all the data that they need. We don't want to limit our auditor to the data from the last year. Maybe he wants to look historically in the past what audit problems we had so that he can check and make sure that those things have been addressed. That would be an example of having extra data. Limitations in technology. Maybe they don't have the right equipment to be able to do the audit. Maybe they need a room in the facility to be able to do their audit. We need to think about that. And then also, like we said, personnel. It might be a one-man job. It depends on how big the IT infrastructure is, whether you're going to need more than one person and people that are available to the auditor to answer questions and things of that nature. So think about that when you're planning your audit. Is the auditor going to have all of these resources that he needs or she needs? So this is what I talked about on the previous slide. Here's some things that can have negative impacts on your audit if you restrict the scope too much. I said not providing enough resources, preventing the discovery of evidence. Are you going to put a leash on your auditor, or are you going to let them, if they find something, do you want them to go get evidence and collect evidence? So you're going to tell the auditor that. Maybe, maybe the auditor finds something that might be kind of shady or maybe something illegal. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the auditor can maybe that would be one of the situations where the scope would get larger, is if we started finding a malfeasance by some of the employees, the scope of the audit may widen so that we can collect more evidence. So these are some of the restrictions that can have a negative impact on your audit. So we got to be careful about them. So here are all of the different types of controls. If you remember, we have different types of controls. Management controls are the policies and procedures. Operational controls have to do with the everyday running of the company. Technical controls have to do with IT systems. When you think of technical controls, think of firewalls. Then we have detective controls that detect fraud, maybe. We have corrective controls that can correct problems that have occurred in the past. So when we think about controls, we can, put them in buckets to be able to describe them so that we can select the appropriate controls that we need in different parts of the infrastructure. So general controls that we see on the top of the cube here are going to be known as infrastructure controls. They apply broadly to all components across an organization. So a general control would apply to everything in the IT universe inside of that company. An application control applies to an individual application system. So it would be, I guess you could think of it as an application, but it only applies to a subset of the IT department. That would be an application control. NIST has come up with 3 buckets for IT security controls called management, operational, and technical controls. Remember, management controls includes controls typically governed by management as part of the overall security program. Like I said, policies, procedures, things of that nature. Operational controls include controls that are implemented by people rather than systems. So these would be controls that would monitor the day-to-day operations of the company and typically are implemented by people rather than a system. So it's not a computer doing the control. If the computer's doing the control, then it's going to be a tech. Like I said, an example of a technical control would be a firewall. An example of an operational control might be separation of duties. All right. We also have types of audits called privacy audits. When we're doing privacy audits, this is like a little subset of the audit. Then you're going to address following 3 concerns. What type of personal information is processed and stored? Where is it stored and how is it managed? So typically when we make our documentation for our IT department, Based on the privacy, we're going to have different levels of risk assigned with the system. So when we have our documentation, it might be labeled data system type A, type B, or type C, or 1, 2, 3. We would classify it by how much personal information is stored on that computer and the danger of losing it. So when we do this risk assessment, this is going to be part of it, is doing this privacy to make sure that the systems that contain this PII, the personal identifiable information, maybe health records, maybe social security numbers, we're going to make sure that we label those systems so that we know that they have special considerations for privacy. When we do an audit, we get a list of controls that are supposed to be present in the system. And the way we find out what security control should be there is to look at the policies of the company and the procedures. After we find out which controls should be there, we're going to find out if it's effective. We're going to check if we can circumvent the control. We're going to check if the control has been circumvented by people in the past. If it's not effective, why do we have it? Remember, controls have an impact on your company. Operational impacts, user impact. There's all these different impacts. When you put a control in place, it makes doing business more difficult. But we say, well, it's worth it because of the security that we get from the control. If the control is not effective, then take it out. That's the part is it required? There's a cost with doing all of these things, these controls. If it is required, how much effort and money should be spent? So if we really need to have it, is it worth the money that we need to spend to have the control in place? Example would be the firewall. Is the firewall going to be effective enough to spend $50,000 on the firewall? Right? So we need to know that stuff. Again, we did some reading last chapter and they talked about enterprise risk management. Remember, enterprise risk management has to do with managing risk across the entire corporation, entire company, not just IT. So when we're doing this enterprise risk management, we're going to identify some components before we start doing the risk management. One is the risk appetite and strategy. The risk appetite has to do with how much risk is a company willing to take? How risky is the business they're in? Are they willing to accept that risk? If you're not, if you're really gun shy and you don't like risk, then you're not going to have a big risk appetite. But if you understand that with risk comes opportunity, you might want to capitalize on that uncertainty and you might have a large risk appetite. It's all going to depend on the company that you're working with. We're also going to look at cross-enterprise risk. So having to do with risks that affect the entire enterprise, the entire company. We're going to try to imagine what could happen to our assets if they or things of value, what risks are out there. We want to reduce surprises. We want to reduce losses. An example of reducing surprises is having a budget for your IT department so that the IT department doesn't show up in the middle of the fiscal year and say, we need a $20,000 firewall. That hasn't been planned for. So what we want to do is identify our cost or our risk or try to see into the future what we're going to need or what's going to happen. So that's part of enterprise risk management. Improve capital allocations. This improves how organizations divide their financial resources to enhance performance and profitability. So again, that's part of budgeting. Um, when we see the risk, when we know the risk, when we know what's going to happen, we can put our money where it's going to be most effective. When we identify these risks, we're going to see opportunities that we can use. Opportunities maybe against our competitors. So it's going to help the organization and recognize events from which new opportunities can be pursued. Um, an example would be thinking about the healthcare law they passed, where you had to cover all your employees. So that was a pretty big shakeup for companies like Walmart. That all of a sudden have all these employees that are working more than 30 hours a week. They're going to have to cover them with health insurance. And I think what happened was Walmart made a decision to use that as an opportunity against their competitors. So they came up with a plan to cover their employees, and they went and got behind the law, the healthcare law. So they got behind it with the federal government and actually pushed it forward, maybe to squash out some of their competitors. That would example of seizing opportunities. If you can see that ahead of time, hey, this is coming down the road, this law, this healthcare law. So let's go ahead and put some money, allocate some capital towards giving all of our employees healthcare. And when we do that, we're going to force our competitors to have to do that also. So all of that stuff is going into seizing opportunities and seeing things coming down the road. And if we have enough resources and capital, and we're not surprised by it, we can take advantage of those opportunities. And then the last part is enhancing risk response decisions. That's going to improve the organization's ability to make decisions about how to better manage risk. So that's going to be our plan for managing risk for an extended period of time. So part of that ERM was the threat analysis. So we're going to do a threat analysis and figure out what is threatening our company, and then we can see down the road what's going to happen. So then we're going to do the threat assessment, and we're going to put them in buckets depending on what types of threats it is. We have accidental threats, we have environmental threats, we have structural threats, and adversarial threats. So when we're sitting down and we're brainstorming about all these things that could happen, all of these threats that could affect our business, putting them in these buckets help us to realize that there is probably more things we need to think about than just what you can come up with sitting at your desk. Some of the resources that we can use to identify vulnerabilities is there are databases on the internet that give us a list of vulnerabilities and the associated risk with those vulnerabilities. So if we go to NVD, nvd.nist.gov, that's the National Vulnerability Database. It has a list of every flaw in every piece of software that you can that exists out on the in IT. So that's an example of a list that we can use to identify vulnerabilities. Security advisories, those would come out in your email maybe. Every time there's a flaw in Microsoft's products, they send out a security advisory. And then we're going to use software and security analysis to check our network to make sure that our patches are put into place, things of that nature. After we take all of those steps and looked at the risk and looked at the vulnerabilities, then we're going to determine what level of risk we're okay with. Um, when we're pairing the threats and the vulnerabilities, risk is determined by three functions. So we're going to have three dimensions to these threats and vulnerabilities. One is going to be the likelihood that a threat is going to actually exploit a vulnerability. So how likely is it that it's going to happen? If there's a 0% chance of something happening, we're probably not going to worry about it. Impact analysis. So we're going to say, what impact would it have on the company if the vulnerability is used, if it's acted upon? So one is, how likely is it to happen? The impact on the organization. And then, are there controls that we can use to reduce the risk? So do we have any controls in place? Or what controls can we use to reduce the risk? Remember, you can never get your risk down to zero. Okay? You can never completely eliminate your risk. So, example would be a flood. What's the likelihood that the server room is going to get flooded? So where would you go to get that information? We could look at the records of the company. If it's a young company, we might look in insurance records, actuaries, floodplain information to find out how often it floods where the building's located. Those are some ideas to get you started to figure out, the likelihood of a flood. If it does flood, what would happen to our organization? Would it be out of business? Would we have to stop processing data for a week? Would we have to stop processing data for a month? That is going to be an impact analysis. And then we need to decide if there are things that we can put in place to reduce the risk from that vulnerability or um, threat. So what we would do is for flooding, we could say, well, we could buy sandbags and put sandbags down around the server room to stop the water from coming in. So that would be in a control, and you would find out how much that control would cost and whether it would be worth it to put sandbags in the server room to stop the flood. Remember, there's always trade-offs for these controls. The cost of the control. Is it justified by the reduction of the risk? If the control is not effective and I'm paying money for it, get rid of it. It's costing me money. It's costing me productivity. Does the control have an adverse impact on system performance? You'll find out that it almost always does. When you turn on encryption, it slows your computer down. Is it worth to have the encryption? That's up to you. That's a risk appetite thing. Is it control technically feasible? Will a control be feasible for the end users? We put a control in that we're going to have body cavity searches of the users when they leave the company to stop them from taking confidential information out of the company. Is that feasible to do body cavity searches to our employees? Well, probably not if you're going to have good employees. They're not going to stand for you doing body cavity searches. So that's an example of the feasibility of these controls. So the auditor has to have a little bit of information or background in whatever he's checking or auditing. For example, IT. If the auditor comes in, the auditor is going to have to understand what the organization does. Is it an IT organization or is it an organization that makes shoes that has IT? So you have to understand the organization. You have to understand the organization's risk appetite. Are they willing to have a risky business, or are they afraid of anything happening to their stuff? The auditor has to understand that in order to be able to make recommendations at the end of the audit when they do the report. The auditor has to understand what controls are in place already, and they have to know best practices. This best practices is what's going to save you if anybody sues you, takes you to court. Just because you put a control in doesn't mean that it's going to help you with liability when you get to court. If it's not something that a normal person would put in place, it's not going to help you in court. If it's something that everybody in your industry does, then that's good. That's going to reduce your liability from, the damages that somebody would get if they sued you in court. We also have to gather information before the audit. We need to have system documentation for all of the servers. We have to have the procedures that we use on the network. We need to have network diagrams. We need to have physical network diagram. We need to have a logical network diagram. You need to look and make sure that the auditor has access to the vendor support documents and agreements. An example would be a support agreement. How long does it take Dell to get you a replacement hard drive when your hard drive dies? Is there a policy for stockpiling hard drives so that we have them on hand when hard drives go bad? That's the type of information the auditor is going to want to have. He needs the organization's written policies. What if the organization doesn't have any policies? Well, it's not a total loss. When you do your audit, what you're going to do is you're going to make recommendations. This policy should be in place. Oh, you don't have an acceptable use policy? Well, that's something that you need. So this audit is also going to help us discover deficiencies in our strategy or our framework. Need administrative documentation. That would be information about employees, HR stuff, those types of informations. System documentation, that's the technical information of all of maybe the servers and the workstations, things that are being audited. Like I said, the procedures, network architecture diagram, and then we're going to need the agreements that we have with vendors, the support agreements. We talked about frameworks last chapter. Remember that frameworks exist to help with risk management programs, security programs, and policy creation. You want to use a framework, number one, because it's going to be flexible. Number two is frameworks are used by other companies in your industry, so that's going to reduce your liability, it's going to reduce your risk, and we don't want to have to recreate everything from scratch. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if somebody already has a framework that's acceptable in our industry. Using a framework also ensures compliance across the IT infrastructure. It's important for the auditor to know what framework an organization has based its policies upon. Then they're going to be able to tell you if the policies are sufficient to satisfy the framework. Here's an example of configuration documentation. This is going to be for maybe your server, right? You're going to have the IP address of your server, what operating system, what patches are put on the system, the hardware specs of the server, what software is installed, what protocols it uses, what services are turned off, what services are turned on. User accounts, password settings, they need the logs from the system. The documentation for all the applications that are on the system. For our network documentation, we need documentation for our firewalls, our web servers, our mail servers, any kind of server that you're running, we're going to have documentation for that. And those are going to be like network devices, routers, switches, servers. So here is the framework for doing an audit interview. So this is the interview that happens before the audit. So we're going to go ahead and prepare for our audit. We're going to schedule it, the audit. So preparing the audit is going to be our interview. Then we're going to make up a schedule for doing the audit. We're going to start the audit. We're going to conduct it, close it, and then record our findings. So these are the different stages of an audit. An appropriate way for you to suggest maybe new controls that need to be put in place is to use available catalogs that are out there. Example of a control catalog would be NIST 800.50-53 and 53A. Remember, 53 is the controls. 53A is the way to document or gauge the effectiveness of the controls. NIST provides a catalog of security controls and a framework to assess them. So remember, 800-53 is the controls. 853A is a framework to assess the controls. Many organizations base their policies on NIST. Why do they do that? Because NIST frameworks are free. The control catalog is free. They're created by the government. You don't have to pay for them. If you do ISO or IEEE, you're going to have to pay for those frameworks. So this is just an overview of where all of these pieces fit together, right? So let me turn my laser pointer. At the top, we're going to have all of the policies. Remember, policies are the overarching documents. They're not specific. They make a statement about the goal of the company. An example would be ABC Incorporated uses strong authentication methods. That doesn't tell you what authentication methods you should use. It just says that we're going to use strong ones. So that would be an example of a policy. And then we're going to have, like I said, these policies in place. We're also going to use standards from our industry. Remember, the more standardized the stuff, the more the better it is if I'm working with another company that uses the same standards, or it reduces my liability if I'm going into court for some reason. Remember, guidelines are good ideas that you don't necessarily need to follow. And then we have procedures. Remember, procedures are mandatory. So we need to make sure that we follow those procedures. And so each one of these different types of policies or standards is going to affect the technology that we buy, the processes that we use in our organization, and it's also going to affect the personnel. So these are all the different dimensions and types of policies we can have. So remember, if you can get your policies, standards, and guidelines to cross the different domains of IT infrastructure, then your organization is going to be more standardized. So there's 7 domains. Remember, we're going to go over them in the rest of the chapters of the book. But there's these policies that might cross every single domain. An example would be access control. We use strong access control methods. That would cross all of our domains. Remote access, WAN, WAN to LAN, the user domain, all of those are going to be are going to have this high level access control policy. So remember that the most important part of your audit or your framework or your IT security program is going to be the testing and monitoring of your systems. We have to test and monitor to make sure that the controls we have in place are working. If they're not working, remember there's a cost associated with it, and we shouldn't have the control in place if it's not effective. All the frameworks that you're going to look at and use are going to include a control objective for regularly assessing and monitoring IT systems and controls. So the objective is the auditing part. When we test our IT systems and monitor it, there are some questions that have to be answered. Are we checking the performance of these controls? Is it going to check them often enough that we check them so that when we find something, is it too late to fix it, or have we had a big loss? So that's going to be the frequency of our testing and monitoring. Does management ensure that internal controls are effective and efficient? Are they writing these policies to make sure that the controls are effective and not wasteful? Can IT performance be linked back to business goals? Right? You want to tie all of the controls back to the policies and the goals of the company. Are adequate confidentiality, integrity, and availability controls in place for information security? That is, do we have enough controls? So not only do the controls we have work, do we need more? Adequate controls should be in place to meet high-level control objectives. Organizational risk assessment plays an important role in identifying high-risk areas. So they have audit guidelines that are put out by SANS. An example would be the top 20 critical security controls. That should give them some idea which ones should be in place. Things that we use, tools that we use during the audit process are going to be project management software, so we can have scope management, time management, things of that nature for the audit. We're going to plan this just like a project. Maybe flow charting software to show dependencies. When we find things, we need to have tracking software to open up an issue or a help desk ticket until that is followed, that audit finding is followed up on. We might have a website where we have all of the audit information on there to communicate that with the rest of the company. So the summary of this chapter is we identified key building blocks and critical requirements of an audit. We talked a lot about planning the audit. We talked about how to identify the critical control points in IT security. We talked about obtaining information through documentation resources. We talked about the organization of security policies inside of a company. We had like a little flow chart showing you where policies, procedures, and regulations go in place. And then we talked about the best practices for testing and monitoring. So that's the end of the lecture. If you have any questions, send me an email. If not, then we will see you next week.